Andrew Thomas couldn't remember the last time he had such a terrible day. As he walked out of Pulse Records, where he'd worked as a producer for nearly 8 years, his shoulders slumped under the weight of everything going wrong. Just this morning, he'd gotten the news that the 3 new artists he'd been counting on had all backed out of their deals. His phone kept buzzing with texts from his boss asking about new talent. "Find me someone special by next month, or we'll have to make some changes," his boss had told him, not quite saying the word fired, but Andrew got the message loud and clear. The evening air felt heavy as dark clouds gathered overhead. Andrew usually drove home, but today his car wouldn't start, just another thing gone wrong. So he decided to walk and clear his head. Without really thinking about it, he took a different path through the old neighborhood park he normally just drove past. The first drops of rain began to fall when Andrew heard something that made him stop dead in his tracks. Someone was playing guitar nearby, and it wasn't just any playing. It was the kind that reaches right into your chest and grabs hold of your heart. "Where is that coming from?" Andrew whispered to himself, forgetting all about the rain now soaking through his jacket. He'd followed the sound around a bend in the path, past some overgrown bushes, until he saw an older man sitting alone on a bench under a large oak tree. The man wore layers of worn-out clothes, his beard was untrimmed, and beside him sat a small backpack that looked like it contained everything he owned. At his feet lay an open guitar case with maybe $3 or $4 in change scattered inside. The man's hands were weathered and rough, but they moved across the guitar strings like they were telling a story only they knew. His eyes were closed as he played, completely lost in the music, not even noticing the rain or Andrew standing there listening. What struck Andrew most wasn't just how good the playing was, and it was incredible, but how the music seemed to hold both deep sadness and unbreakable hope at the same time. The melody wasn't like anything Andrew had heard on the radio or in the studio. It felt real, raw, like life itself turned into sound. For 5 whole minutes, Andrew just stood there in the rain watching and listening. When the man finally finished the song and opened his eyes, he seemed surprised to find someone standing there. "Sorry to bother you," Andrew said, stepping closer. "But that was something else. Where'd you learn to play like that?" The man looked up, studying Andrew's face like he was trying to figure out if this was some kind of joke. His eyes were tired but clear, and when he spoke his voice was rough from not being used much. "Been playing longer than you've been alive, I expect," he said with a slight smile that disappeared quickly. "Name's Robert." "I'm Andrew. I work in music. I'm a producer at Pulse Records," Andrew said, pulling out his wallet and dropping a $20 bill into the guitar case. It was more than he could really afford today, but something told him it mattered. Robert looked at the money, then back at Andrew. "Don't need charity, just playing 'cause I need to. Always needed to." "That's not charity," Andrew said, suddenly feeling more alive than he had in months. "That's me paying for the best music I've heard all year. And I listen to music for a living." The rain was coming down harder now, but neither man seemed to notice. In that moment, under the shelter of the old oak tree, something important was happening, something that would change both their lives forever, though neither of them knew it yet. "You mind if I sit?" Andrew asked, pointing to the empty space on the bench. Robert shrugged. "It's a free country. At least that's what they tell me." The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and Andrew took off his wet jacket, not caring that his white shirt underneath was getting damp. "That guitar, it's a vintage Gibson, isn't it?" Robert's eyes lit up for a moment. "You know your instruments." His weathered hands moved protectively over the wood. "Had her for almost 40 years now. My father gave it to me when I was just starting out." "Starting out?" Andrew asked. Robert sighed, looking off into the distance. "Yeah, back when people knew me as Blues Robert Wilson, played with some big names in the 80s. Jackson Tenor, the Blackwater Band, even opened for Stevie Ray Vaughan once." He ran his fingers along the guitar's neck. "Feel like that was somebody else's life now." Andrew couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Wait, you're that Robert Wilson, the one who played on Midnight Train?" For the first time, Robert really looked at Andrew, surprise crossing his face. "You know that track? That was a lifetime ago. My dad had that album. Played it all the time when I was growing up," Andrew said, genuine excitement in his voice. "What happened? Why aren't you still playing professionally?" Robert's face darkened. "Life happened, young man. Made some bad choices. got mixed up with the wrong substances, wrong people. When my wife left me, took our daughter with her, I just fell apart. He looked down at his worn-out boots, been living on the streets for going on 15 years now. Andrew noticed how, despite everything, Robert's guitar was in perfect condition. But you kept the guitar all this time. Only thing I got left that means anything, Robert said quietly. Had chances to sell it. Times when I was so hungry I could barely think straight, but something always stopped me. This guitar, it's the only thing that still knows who I really am. The simplicity and truth of those words hit Andrew hard. Here was a man who'd lost everything but still clung to his music like it was air to breathe. You know, Andrew said, pulling out his card from his wallet, I'm a producer at Pulse Records. I work with musicians every day, and I haven't heard playing like yours in, well, maybe ever. Robert took the card but laughed, a rough sound like he hadn't done it in a while. Sure, kid. I've heard that before. Industry people make big promises when they hear something they like. Then they disappear. I'm not making any promises, Andrew said. But you're hungry, right? I'm hungry too. There's a diner around the corner. Let me buy you dinner and we can just talk. About music, about whatever. Robert stared at him, trying to figure out if this was some kind of joke or trick. Why would you do that? Because I've had a really bad day, Andrew said honestly. And your music is the only good thing that's happened to me in weeks. I just want to hear more about it. Something in Andrew's voice must have sounded genuine, because after a long moment, Robert carefully placed his guitar in its case and snapped it shut. Well, I ain't one to turn down a hot meal, he said, standing up slowly. His knees cracked as he rose, betraying years of sleeping in the cold. At Dot's Diner, under the bright fluorescent lights, Andrew could see just how rough life had been for Robert. His face was deeply lined, his hands calloused not just from guitar strings, but from the hardness of life on the streets. Yet his eyes still held a spark when he talked about music. Over plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, they talked for hours. Robert told stories about the old days, touring in vans that broke down every 100 miles, playing in smoky clubs where you could barely see the audience, the pure joy of being on stage when everything clicked. You ever think about playing professionally again? Andrew asked finally, as the waitress refilled their coffee cups for the third time. Robert stirred his coffee slowly. Don't think like that anymore. Just take each day as it comes. But if you could, if someone offered you a real chance. Robert's eyes met Andrew's. At my age? With my history? Who'd take that chance? Andrew took a deep breath. I might. You can't be serious, Andrew, said Tina, head of A&R at Pulse Records. Her voice echoed through the conference room where the team had gathered for their weekly meeting. We need established artists, not some homeless guy you found in the park. Around the table, Andrew's colleagues nodded in agreement. Look, said David, the finance director, barely looking up from his spreadsheet, the label is already on thin ice financially. We can't afford to waste studio time on charity cases. Andrew felt his face getting hot. He'd spent the whole weekend thinking about Robert and his incredible playing. Just give him one session. 3 hours, that's all I'm asking. And who's going to pay for that time? Asked Tina, eyebrows raised. Take it out of my personal studio allowance, Andrew replied without hesitation. His boss, Pete, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward. You'd risk your own studio time on this guy? In a heartbeat, Andrew said. Just wait until you hear him play. After much argument, they reluctantly agreed to one short session on Wednesday afternoon, the slowest time of the week. As Andrew left the meeting, he could hear the whispers behind him. He's lost his mind. Always had a soft spot for lost causes. Career suicide. Andrew ignored them all and called the shelter where Robert had told him he sometimes stayed. He left a message, having no idea if Robert would even get it. For the next 2 days, Andrew prepared everything, booking the best sound engineer he knew and even asking a session drummer and bassist to come in just in case. By Wednesday morning, he still hadn't heard from Robert. As the hours ticked by, his stomach twisted with anxiety. Half an hour before the scheduled session, Andrew stood outside the studio building, scanning the street. Nothing. Maybe his colleagues were right. Maybe this was a waste of time. Just as he was about to give up hope, he spotted a figure at the end of the block, walking slowly, a guitar case in hand. Robert had come, but with each step, he seemed to be fighting an internal battle. "I almost didn't," Robert admitted when he finally reached Andra. He was wearing clean jeans and a button-up shirt that were clearly from a donation bin, but he'd made an effort. His hair was combed, his beard trimmed a bit. "Spent all night telling myself this was just another disappointment waiting to happen." "But you're here," Andra said, relief washing over him. Robert nodded, clutching his guitar case tightly. "Something told me to trust you. Don't make me regret it." As they rode the elevator up to the studio, Robert grew quieter. His hands shook slightly as they approached the studio door. "Been a long time since I've been in a real recording space," he mumbled. "Things have changed a lot, I bet." "The technology's different," Andra said, "but music is still music." When they walked into the control room, the engineer Tom looked up with barely disguised surprise. The session musicians Andra had called in, Ben on drums and Louis on bass, stood awkwardly in the corner, clearly not sure what to expect. "Everyone, this is Robert Wilson," Andra announced. "Robert, this is the team for today." "The Robert Wilson?" Tom asked, eyes widening. "From the Blackwater Band?" A ghost of a smile crossed Robert's face. "Long time ago." "Man, your solo on River Rising changed how I thought about guitar playing," Tom said, suddenly animated. "It's an honor to work with you." Something in Robert's stance changed slightly. He stood a bit taller, nodded a bit more confidently. "Why don't you sit up in the booth?" Andra suggested, "and we'll just run through a couple of things. No pressure. Think of it as a jam session." Robert nodded and headed into the recording booth. Through the glass, Andra watched him take out his guitar with the same care a parent might show handling a newborn. He spent a few minutes tuning it, then looked up, nodding that he was ready. "What do you want me to play?" he asked through the microphone. "Whatever feels right," Andra replied. "Whatever you were playing in the park when I found you." Robert closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and then his fingers touched the strings. What happened next left everyone in the control room speechless. The music that filled the space wasn't just technically brilliant, it was alive with emotion. Every note told the story of loss, of struggle, of somehow holding on to hope when there was no reason to. The session musicians, who had been standing back, gradually moved closer to the glass, watching in amazement. After about 5 minutes, Robert paused, opening his eyes. "Is that okay? Should I try something different?" Tom, the engineer who had worked with some of the biggest names in the business, just stared open-mouthed at Andra. "Where on earth did you find him?" "I told you," Andra said, unable to keep the smile off his face. "In the park." He pressed the talkback button. "That was perfect, Robert. Would you mind if Ben and Louis joined you? Just to see how it sounds with some backing." For the next 2 hours, the studio was filled with the kind of music that reminded everyone why they had gotten into this business in the first place. The session musicians picked up Robert's cues instinctively, following where his guitar led them. By the end, they weren't just playing together, they were creating something none of them could have made alone. When they finally finished, there was a moment of profound silence in the control room. Then Tom looked at Andra with newfound respect. "You were right," he said quietly. "This isn't charity. This is music." The demo recordings from that first session spread through Pulse Records like wildfire. Even Pete, the normally hard-to-impress label head, had called Andra into his office and admitted there was something special about Robert's playing. "I'll give you a month," Pete said. "Work with him, clean him up a bit, and let's see if we can turn this into something marketable." Andra rented a small room for Robert at a nearby boarding house. Nothing fancy, but clean and warm, with a real bed and a door that locked. He brought him clothes, made sure he had regular meals, and set up a schedule for studio time. For 2 weeks, everything seemed to be moving in the right direction. Robert showed up on time, played beautifully, and even started working on new songs with Andra. The rough edges of street life began to soften, and glimpses of the professional musician he'd once been started to show through. Then one morning, Robert didn't show up for their session. "Have you seen him?" Andra asked the boarding house manager, who just shook his head. "Room's empty. Guitar's gone too. Left everything else behind." Andra spent the entire day searching the parks, shelters, and street corners where homeless people gathered. No sign of Robert. He asked everyone he met, showing a photo he'd taken on his phone, but no one had seen him, or if they had, they weren't saying. 3 days passed with no word. Andrew barely slept, worried sick about what might have happened. Had Robert gone back to old habits? Was he hurt somewhere? Had the pressure of the studio become too much? On the 4th day, just as Andrew was about to file a missing person report, his phone rang from an unknown number. "It's me." Robert's voice sounded rough-tired. "I'm at St. Mary's Hospital." Andrew rushed there, his heart pounding. He found Robert in a hospital bed, looking smaller somehow, an IV in his arm. "What happened?" Andrew asked, pulling a chair close to the bed. "Panic attack," Robert said, not meeting Andrew's eyes. "Bad one. Chest felt like it was being crushed. Thought I was having a heart attack. Some lady called an ambulance when she saw me collapse in the park." He finally looked up. "They said it was anxiety, stress. My body's not used to normal life anymore." And I felt a wave of guilt. "I've been pushing too hard, haven't I?" Robert shook his head slowly. "It's not you. It's me. Been living like a ghost for so long, I don't know how to be a real person anymore. The studio, the schedule, people counting on me. It all started feeling like walls closing in." He closed his eyes. "So I ran. It's what I've always done when things get too real." After Robert was released from the hospital, Andrew slowed things down. No pressure, no schedules, just casual jam sessions whenever Robert felt up to it. But Pete and the other executives were growing impatient. "We need to make a decision about this project," Pete said during their weekly meeting. "We've invested time and money. We need to see results." "He's not ready for the spotlight yet," Andrew argued. "He needs more time." "Time is money," Tina cut in. "And we're running out of both." Finally, Pete made an ultimatum. "Set up a private showcase, just for the executive team. If he impresses us, we move forward. If not, we pull the plug." Andrew knew it was the best deal he was going to get. He spent the next week preparing Robert, trying to build his confidence without adding pressure. The day of the showcase arrived. The small performance space at the label was set up simply, just a chair, a microphone, and Robert's guitar. The executives filed in, faces neutral, notepads ready. Robert was waiting in a side room, and Andrew could see his hands trembling as he tuned his guitar. "You don't have to do this," Andrew said quietly. "We can find another way." "No," Robert replied. "You believed in me." "I need to try." But when he walked out to face the row of expressionless executives, something changed. Robert froze, his fingers hovering over the strings. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Sweat beaded on his forehead. I'm sorry," he finally whispered, before putting down the guitar and walking quickly out of the room. Andrew found him outside, sitting on a bench, head in his hands. "They're right," Robert said without looking up. "I'm a lost cause. You should have left me in that park." The executives weren't kind afterward. "This is business, not charity," Pete said firmly. "I'm sorry, Andrew, but we're pulling the funding." That night, Andrew sat alone in the empty studio, listening to the recordings they'd made. The music was still amazing, raw, honest, powerful. But what good was incredible music if the musician couldn't perform? Had he just been fooling himself, thinking he could save someone who'd been lost for so long? For the first time since finding Robert in the park, Andrew wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake, not just for Robert, but for himself. His colleagues barely spoke to him now. His reputation at the label was in tatters. He'd spent his own money on Robert's housing and food, maxing out credit cards he couldn't afford to pay. As the last recording finished playing, Andrew put his head down on the mixing console and closed his eyes, exhausted and defeated. He had no idea where to go from here. Andrew woke up to someone shaking his shoulder. He'd fallen asleep in the studio, his cheek pressed against the mixing board. It took him a moment to realize it was Tom, the sound engineer. "You've been here all night?" Tom asked, putting down a cup of coffee in front of Andrew. Andrew rubbed his eyes, trying to make sense of where he was. "What time is it?" "Almost 7 in the morning. I came in early to work on the Henderson project." Tom sat down in the chair next to him. "Heard about what happened at the showcase. Tough break." Andrew took a sip of the coffee, grateful for its warmth. "I don't know what to do now. The labels pulled the funding. Robert's probably gone back to the streets. I've messed up my career." "And for what?" Tom was quiet for a moment. "You know, I lost my brother to addiction 5 years ago." Andrew looked up, surprised by the personal admission. He was a lot like your friend Robert, Tom continued. Talented guy, played drums like nobody's business. But he couldn't get past his demons. Nobody could reach him. Tom's voice caught slightly. I always wish someone had tried harder with him, given him one more chance. Before Andrew could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. It's Robert. Can we talk? I'm outside your apartment. Half an hour later, Andrew found Robert sitting on the steps of his apartment building, guitar case beside him. He looked exhausted but somehow more present than he'd been in days. How'd you know where I live? Andrew asked. You wrote your address on that boarding house form, Robert replied. Good thing I've got a decent memory. He took a deep breath. I came to apologize and to say goodbye properly. You deserved better than me just walking out. Where will you go? Andrew asked, sitting down next to him. Robert shrugged. Back to the park, I guess. Back to how things were. He patted his guitar case. At least I've still got my old friend here. They sat in silence for a minute before Andrew spoke. I've been thinking about my brother a lot lately. Didn't know you had a brother, Robert said. I don't. Not anymore. Andrew looked down at his hands. His name was Leon. He was 4 years older than me. Brilliant pianist, way more talented than I ever was. But he got hooked on pills after a car accident, then moved on to harder stuff. Andrew's voice grew quieter. I found him in our parents' bathroom when I was 19, needle still in his arm. Robert didn't say anything, just listened. I couldn't save him, Andrew continued. No matter what I tried, I couldn't get through to him. And when I saw you playing in that park, it was like I was getting another chance somehow. Robert's weathered face softened. So I was your redemption project. At first, maybe, Andrew admitted. But then I heard your music, really heard it, and I knew it needed to be shared. He looked Robert in the eyes. Your music tells the truth about pain in a way nothing else can. And maybe that's what people need to hear. Robert picked up a small pebble from the step and tossed it across the sidewalk. I've been thinking too, about why I freaked out at that showcase. He tossed another pebble. It wasn't just stage fright, it was shame. Shame? Andrew asked. Yeah. Standing there in front of all those important people, I suddenly felt the weight of everything I'd thrown away. My career, my family, 20 years of my life. Robert's voice grew rough. I looked at their faces and thought, they know. They can see what I am. A junkie. A failure. A man who abandoned his own daughter. You have a daughter? Andrew asked softly. Robert nodded, pain etched into the lines of his face. Haven't seen her since she was 12. She'd be 32 now. His hand instinctively went to his guitar case. This guitar was supposed to be hers someday. Her grandfather gave it to me, and I was supposed to pass it on. But I lost that right a long time ago. They sat together as the morning sun grew stronger, warming the steps beneath them. Something had shifted between them, no longer just a producer and a potential artist, but two broken people sharing their wounds. I've been seeing someone, Robert said eventually. A counselor at the shelter. Only a couple times, but it helps. To talk about things. That's good, Andrew said. Really good. He says making music might be healing for me. That maybe I need to play, not just for a career, but for myself. Robert hesitated. I was thinking, maybe we could still record something, not for the label, just for us, just to get these songs out of me before they eat me alive. Andrew felt something stir in his chest, not the ambitious drive of a producer chasing success, but something quieter and more genuine. I'd like that, he said. We can use the studio after hours when no one's around. Just you, me, and the music. No pressure, no expectations. Robert nodded, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. I'd like that too. Over the next few weeks, they settled into a new routine. Late nights in the studio, just the two of them. Robert would play, Andrew would record. Sometimes they talked about their pasts, about the people they'd lost and the mistakes they'd made. Sometimes they didn't talk at all, letting the music speak for them. The songs they created weren't polished radio hits. They were raw and complicated, full of Robert's pain and resilience. Andrew found himself looking forward to their sessions, not as career opportunities, but as moments of truth rarely found in the manufactured world of commercial music. Slowly, something began to heal in both of them, Wounds that had been festering for years finally exposed to the air and light. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, but a quiet rebuilding, note by note, session by session. "You know," Robert said one night after they'd finished recording a particularly powerful track, "I think I've been hiding from music because it forces me to feel everything I've been running from." Andrew nodded, understanding completely. Sometimes the thing that heals you is the same thing that hurts. 3 months had passed since the failed showcase. Andrew and Robert continued their late-night recording sessions, building a collection of songs that told Robert's life story, the highs, the lows, and everything in between. Neither of them talked much about what would happen with the recordings. They were focused on the process, not the outcome. One evening, Tom, the sound engineer, stayed late to help them with a particularly tricky mix. "You know," he said, listening to their latest track, "this stuff is incredible. What are you planning to do with it?" And Robert exchanged glances. They hadn't really thought that far ahead. "Seems a shame to keep it locked away in this studio," Tom continued. "Music like this needs to be heard." "By who?" Robert asked. "I can't even play in front of a handful of executives without falling apart." Tom thought for a moment. "There's this place called the Blue Note. Small venue, maybe holds 50 people. Very low-key. My buddy runs it. They do an open mic night every Thursday." He looked at Robert. "Might be a good place to start. No pressure, just music lovers." Robert shook his head immediately. "I don't think I'm ready for that." "Just think about it," Tom said before packing up his things. "Sometimes the only way past the fear is through it." After Tom left, Robert sat quietly, plucking absently at his guitar strings. "He means well," Andrew said, "but we don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with. You know what scares me the most?" Robert said after a while, "Not the playing, it's the eyes. All those people looking at me, judging me, seeing what I've become." Andrew considered this. What if they couldn't see you? The following Thursday, Andrew and Robert stood in the dark alley behind the Blue Note. The place was exactly as Tom had described, small, intimate, with mismatched chairs and tables crowded around a tiny stage lit by a single spotlight. "I still think this is a bad idea," Robert muttered, clutching his guitar case. "Remember the plan," Andrew said encouragingly. "No introduction, no name. The lights will be down except for the spotlight on your hands and guitar. Nobody will see your face. Just play one song and we'll leave." Robert took a deep breath. One song. That's it. They had timed their arrival to coincide with the brief break between performers. Tom's friend, the owner, had agreed to the unusual setup without asking too many questions. As they slipped in through the back door, Andrew could feel Robert tensing beside him. The small crowd was chatting quietly, sipping drinks, waiting for the next act. "And now," the host announced, "we have a special guest joining us tonight." The room darkened completely before a single spotlight illuminated only the chair on stage and the area where a guitarist's hands would be. A murmur of curiosity rippled through the audience. Robert walked slowly to the chair, his face in shadows, only his hands and guitar visible in the light. For a moment, Andrew thought he might turn and run. But instead, Robert sat down, positioned his guitar, and began to play. The chattering crowd fell silent within seconds. Robert started with a gentle melody that gradually built in complexity and emotion. It was a song they'd recorded together, one that spoke of loss and longing, of streets both literal and metaphorical that had led him away from the people he loved. When he began to sing, his voice rough but powerful, Andrew saw people at the nearest tables lean forward. A woman at the front wiped tears from her eyes. A man closed his eyes, nodding slowly with the rhythm. As the song reached its climax, Robert's voice cracked with emotion, but instead of pulling back, he leaned into it, letting the raw pain and hope shine through. When the final note faded, there was a moment of complete silence. Then the room erupted. The applause was deafening in the small space, people standing, calling for more. The spotlight remained fixed on Robert's hands, which were trembling slightly as he gripped his guitar. "One more." Someone shouted from the back. Others joined in the call. Robert sat frozen, clearly overwhelmed by the response. Andrew slipped closer to the stage. "It's your call," he said quietly. "We can leave right now if you want." Robert hesitated, then leaned forward to speak into the microphone. "I've got one more for you." For the next song, something unexpected happened. Robert slowly lifted his head, allowing the light to catch his face. It was a conscious choice, a small but significant act of courage. His eyes remained focused on his guitar at first, but as the song progressed, he occasionally glanced up, making brief eye contact with audience members in the front row. The second song led to demands for a third, and then a fourth. By the fifth song, Robert was fully visible in the spotlight, still nervous but engaged with the audience, even sharing a brief story about where one of the songs had come from. Nearly an hour later, when Robert finally signaled that he was finished, the audience gave him a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. People crowded around the small stage, wanting to talk to him, to shake his hand, to tell him how his music had moved them. An older man with silver hair pushed his way through to Robert. "Excuse me," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Frank Wilson with Crossroads Records. I'd very much like to talk with you both." He glanced at Andra. "That is, if you're his producer." Andra nodded, speechless. Crossroads was a small but respected independent label known for acoustic and blues artists. As they talked with Frank, Andra watched Robert carefully, ready to step in if he seemed overwhelmed. But something had shifted during the performance. Robert stood straighter, spoke more confidently. The fear wasn't gone, but he was facing it rather than running from it. Later that night, as they walked back to Andra's car, Robert stopped suddenly. "You know what felt different tonight?" he said. "I wasn't playing to be judged or evaluated. I was playing to be heard." He looked at Andra. "For the first time in years, I remembered why I loved music in the first place. Not for the applause or the record deals, but because it's the only way I know to tell the truth." Andra smiled. "And people responded to that truth." "Yeah," Robert said, looking up at the night sky. They did. 18 months after Andra first heard Robert playing in the park, they stood backstage at the Riverside Theater. Through the curtain, they could hear the buzz of the sold-out crowd waiting for Robert's first major performance since the release of his album, Second Chances, on Crossroads Records. "Nervous?" Andra asked, adjusting Robert's collar. "Terrified," Robert admitted with a small smile. "But the good kind of terrified." He looked down at his guitar, still the same vintage Gibson, now professionally restored but with all its character intact. "Never thought I'd be here again." The journey to this moment hadn't been easy. After signing with Crossroads, Robert had insisted on two conditions. Andra would produce the album, and a portion of any profits would go to supporting homeless musicians. Frank Wilson had readily agreed to both. The recording process had its ups and downs. Some days, Robert's confidence soared. Other days, old demons resurfaced, and he'd struggled just to pick up his guitar. He'd started attending therapy regularly and joined a support group for recovering addicts. 6 months into sobriety, he'd received his first-year chip, and Andre had been there to celebrate with him. 5 minutes, called the stage manager, clipboard in hand. Robert took a deep breath. "I wish my dad could see this. He always believed I'd make something of myself, even when I stopped believing it." "He'd be proud," Andra said, meaning it. As Robert did his final tuning checks, Andra spotted someone waiting quietly at the edge of the backstage area. A woman in her early 30s, nervously twisting a program in her hands. "Robert," Andra said softly, "there's someone here to see you." Robert looked up, confused. Then his hands froze on the guitar strings. "Amy?" His voice barely above a whisper. The woman stepped forward, tears already forming in her eyes. "Hi, Dad." After seeing Robert's story in a music magazine, Amy Wilson had reached out through Crossroads Records. It had taken Andra weeks to convince Robert to respond, his shame and fear of rejection nearly overwhelming him. But finally, they'd arranged this meeting, deliberately scheduled for right before the biggest performance of Robert's new career. "You came," Robert said, standing up but not moving closer, as if afraid she might disappear. "I wasn't sure I would," Annie admitted. "I had a whole speech planned about all the birthdays and holidays you missed." Her voice caught. "But then I heard your album, and it was like you were finally telling me where you'd been all these years." Robert stood perfectly still, years of regret visible on his face. "I don't expect forgiveness." "I'm not offering forgiveness yet," Emmy interrupted gently. "I'm offering a chance. The same kind of chance that man gave you." She nodded toward Andra. Robert looked back and forth between his daughter and the producer who'd changed his life, clearly overwhelmed. "I don't deserve either of you," he said quietly. "Maybe not," Emmy replied with a small smile. "But that's not how chances work." She stepped forward and gave him a quick, slightly awkward hug. "I'll be sitting in the third row. Don't mess up." Then she was gone, heading back to her seat in the audience. 2 minutes, called the stage manager. Robert turned to Andra, his eyes wide. "I can't do this, not with her watching." "Yes, you can," Andra said firmly. "Your music brought her here. Now let it show her who you really are." Robert took a shaky breath, then nodded. He waited in the wings as the house lights dimmed and the announcer introduced him. The applause was enthusiastic. His album had been receiving rave reviews, praised for its raw honesty and emotional depth. As Robert walked onto the stage, the spotlight caught him, no longer something to hide from but something to step into willingly. He sat down on the stool at center stage, adjusted his microphone, and looked out at the audience. Andra saw him scan the third row until he found Amy's face. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Robert said into the microphone. "This first song is called Full Circle. It's about finding your way back to where you were always meant to be." As the first notes filled the theater, Andra watched from the side of the stage, remembering the rainy evening in the park when he'd first heard those talented hands play. The contrast between that moment and this one was extraordinary, yet the music still carried the same soul, the same truth. After the show, as fans lined up to have albums signed, Andra slipped away to the back of the venue. There, near the merchandise table, he spotted a familiar scene that made him stop and watch. Robert had set up a small booth with a handwritten sign, "Guitar Lessons for the Homeless," sponsored by Second Chances Foundation. A young man in worn clothes was cautiously picking up one of the guitars on display, his fingers moving awkwardly across the strings. Robert gently adjusted the young man's hand position, demonstrating the proper technique. The concentration on both their faces, the simple human connection of one musician helping another, struck Andra as the perfect completion of their journey. Later that night, after the fans had gone and the crew was packing up equipment, Robert found Andra sitting alone in the empty theater. "Hard to believe this all started because your car broke down and you had to walk through the park," Robert said, sitting down beside him. Andra smiled. "Some might call that fate." "Or just dumb luck," Robert laughed. "Either way, I'm grateful." He looked out at the empty seats, now shadowed in the dim light. "You know, for years on those streets, I kept asking why. Why did my life fall apart? Why couldn't I get clean? Why did I lose everyone I loved?" He strummed a soft chord on his guitar. "Now I think maybe all that had to happen so I could be right here, helping others who are where I was." Andra nodded, understanding completely. Sometimes our worst days lead us exactly where we need to go. As they walked out of the theater together into the cool night air, Andra noticed Robert pause to drop some money into the guitar case of a street musician playing near the exit, a simple gesture that said more than words ever could about how far they'd both come. Full circle, indeed.